Okay. So we may just...
So we're just waiting for a few participants to come in here.
Yeah, we give it a few minutes.
You'll give it about a minute. Yeah. All right. I'm seeing that attendees are joining us now, so we'll just get started. Welcome, everyone. Thank you for joining us for the 2021 UN South Asia Forum on Business and Human Rights. This is a session titled Extractives and Rights of Indigenous Peoples. I'm Dory from Q Design, and I'll be your technical facilitator today. Both actually the chat function will be off today, but the Q&A will be on, and you'll be able to upvote, comment, and send your questions to speakers there, as well as engage in conversations through the comments feature within the Q&A function at the bottom of your Zoom window. Please note that the session today is being recorded. If you have any questions about Zoom or require technical assistance, please feel free to send a message on the Q&A or raise your hand, and I will be happy to assist you. I'll now hand over to Patrick. Patrick, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. That's very nice of you to me. So, namaste, namaskar, everybody. It's very nice. Thank you for joining us. I'd like to begin with an acknowledgement of the organisers, UNDP and their Business and Human Rights team, for organising this forum and for this important session also, and with particular thanks to the UN Working Group on Business and Human Rights. And with that thanks, thank you for the invitation to moderate this important session. I think that invitation came on the basis of the work that the Diplomacy Training Programme has been doing, particularly in partnership with Asia Indigenous Peoples Pact around business and human rights and the rights of Indigenous peoples. And that work began many years ago. In particular, I recall a program that we were working on with Indigenous peoples in the Philippines, with Indigenous activists and advocates from all across the Philippines. And they were asking the question really around, these are human rights standards, we understand the obligations of the state, but in the first instance, the harms that are being done to us are being done by companies. How do we hold them accountable? And that was back in 2003. And I think we're still searching for the answers in many ways, but it has been an extraordinary time in terms of the development of standards, the acknowledgement of rights. We have now the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. We have the right of Indigenous peoples to free, prior and informed consent, recognised globally by governments. And we have the UN Guiding Principles on Business and Human Rights. We have the OECD guidelines on multinational enterprises, which also reinforce the rights of Indigenous peoples, the human rights of Indigenous peoples. And we have a growing wealth of experience in advocacy around these issues. So I think over the last number of years, we can see that there's been greater acknowledgement of the wrongs, greater perhaps awareness of the rights of Indigenous peoples, but we still see this continuing problem of limited pathways for remedy and for action to redress wrongs. So that makes this panel very important, very relevant. We have a really excellent panel of speakers. I think we have a particular urgency around the discussions today, which are around the impacts of COVID and what sort of world will emerge from COVID, especially in light of our commitments around climate change and the Glasgow summit later this year. which is perhaps a last chance to act on the climate emergency. So let me begin, if I can, by introducing Dr. Usha Ramanathan from India. I suspect she needs no introduction. She's and I have said that really it would take a very long time to list our speakers' accomplishment, and that's particularly true for Dr. Usha Ramanathan. So she's very experienced, she's widely published, she's a very inspirational advocate, and she has worked a lot in the area around the jurisprudence of law, poverty, development. And I think she is the perfect person to really set the scene for us around the impacts of extractives on human rights and the rights of Indigenous peoples. And so I've asked her if she can lead, and then we will hear from Prabrinda Shakya to give us a perspective from Indigenous peoples in the region, before we go to Jennifer Rietberger, who has been researching these issues with the Responsible Mining Foundation and the Responsible Mining Index, and has some very valuable findings to share from there. Then we will go back to the ground to hear about experiences from India and from Bangladesh. Then we'll have a sharing, we hope, between the panelists and between all of you. We hope this will be a discussion. We are asking you all to actively use the Q&A function that has been provided, both to ask questions, to make contributions, to have a dialogue with each other. And we hope that through this process we can help to address the questions that have been given to us by the organisers. And that's partly looking at sharing a good practice and looking at ways forward. So Usha, please, can I give you the floor?
Thank you, Patrick. I'll just launch straight into it. I know that people who are listening in are people who know what the basic issues are. So some of what I'm saying are going to be a recap of what we've seen over the past 30, 40 years, and many of them unresolved issues, and one or two maybe somewhat new in the sense that we haven't addressed them sufficiently before. So the first thing, of course, is that we learned how to even confront the idea of what we call tribal communities, but what are basically indigenous communities, and the kind of impact that mainstream dominant practices have had on the lives of people who've been, partly left alone and partly neglected for decades, centuries. So the first thing, of course, is that we learn to recognize that through this development and displacement discourse, where development projects were demanding land and the resources that lie under the land to be taken over by the state and by corporations, for them to convert it into something that would take the state, somewhere else. So in the early 1990s, we learned to, it became pretty clear that about 60% of the people who were being displaced to make way for this kind of development, at least 60%, were indigenous people. And what makes it particularly poignant is that these are communities who have who've not had the state addressing any of the issues that arise for the community. And yet, the moment a development project has to come in, suddenly the community becomes visible. So we have this concept of invisibilizing, which is an active concept, which means that it is not that people are invisible, but people are invisibilized. And then they get visibilized when the development process requires them to be visibilized and moved away. So this idea of development, displacement, and invisibilizing is something we've seen over the years, and unfortunately it continues now. The good thing is that communities have asserted themselves and are much more aware of what a state is and what needs to be done in terms of corporatization, in terms of the state. So speaking truth to power is something that more and more communities are doing now. We have, for instance, in India, a group called Land Conflict Watch. And if you go to the website, you'll see that they're there. And the number of places where conflict exists. Now, the idea is not just to valorize conflict, but to say that people are asserting their rights in those places, that becomes significant. The second thing is that the battle over land carries on and on and on. The state never seems to give up. The companies never give up. And fortunately, communities never give up. But it is pretty evident that increasingly it has become difficult for the state and for the companies to take it for granted that they can just dislocate communities and take over lands. So that has been a very important friction point, which has allowed communities to retain control over their lives and over their resources. The third is about autonomy. There has been a lot of, it's been a grudging need and will assert autonomy at various levels. It's been a hard grind for communities to establish that, but states have not been able to deny it altogether. So it's a pressure point that is kept on, and it's been a very important part of what's been happening, not only to communities, but the kind of impact that that has had on the environment and sustainability over this period of time. The fourth thing, which actually for me at least is pretty new in the way in which it is being articulated, is the idea of culture. I mean, we've had discussions in human rights fora for a long time now saying, why is it that we say socio-economic rights, but we are so wary about touching culture because we don't know what to do with it. And that, kind of exploded when we had a community in, actually in Orissa, where I live now, in Niyamgiri, the Dongriya Khonds, who said, we are saying that we don't want mining to happen on this hill because that's where our gods reside. Would you allow, at the same time in India, we were having a huge battle going on around where the Hindu right wing was saying their god resided. So they were saying, how is it that your gods have a right to reside where they want, but ours are here and you can't respect that. So the idea of culture has been important. And a couple of other things. One, that I think we need to factor in the role that technology is beginning to play. Some of it may not be altogether bad, but overall, I think it is the most unmonitored sector. And because we don't understand it enough, we are letting too much happen without, and so for instance, the difference between land rights, land records, and land titling are all getting lost. I mean, it's like they're conflating it whenever they want, and they have completely different meanings. One of the great things that's happened in this time is, for instance, the recognition that historical injustice has been done to forest-dwelling communities, and that this historical injustice has to be undone, and therefore rights not given, not settled, but recognized. So the wrongdoing, the wrongness of some of the actions of the colonial and post-colonial state, I think that has become much more pervasive in our discourses now. And I'll just end with this, that we recently had a film which has been written about, made by two economists on one of our iconic projects, which showed what, the kind of mass displacement that happens, especially of tribal communities in the Narmada Valley, the Sardar Sarovar Dam. And these two economists, it's such an, I mean, I'm sorry to say that, I'm saying it like a reviewer now, but it's such an absurd way of looking at this. So they say, 32% say they have more electricity here than they had in the place where they were before. 8% are getting more. This is 30 years and 40 years after grand rehabilitation, programs are supposed to have happened. And they justify it saying indigenous people are happier in places where they've been dislocated and taken away because they maybe get tap water, I don't know, whatever. So I think this imagination of indigeneity and the imagination of what it means to have that relationship, that needs to be brought back to center stage and made part of regular discourse.
Wow. Thank you very much, Usha. That's terrific. And you've raised lots of very big issues, which I hope the other panelists and indeed our audience can respond to, including, I think, very importantly, that sense of mobilized communities. And I think where you've finished is also a great segue into our next speaker, Prabindra Shakya, that sense of the importance of hearing from Indigenous peoples, their perspectives, how their voices are heard, heard and have influence. And I think Prabinder brings great experience from that, not just from his own activism as a member of the Nuar community in Nuar Indigenous community in Nepal, but also from his work with Asia Indigenous Peoples Pact, which has been leading the mobilization of Indigenous communities around the extractive industries, the impacts of mining for a long time now, and has a wealth of experience to share, but also from his work with the UN Permanent Forum on Indigenous Issues, which has done a lot of work highlighting the impacts of companies, the extractive industries on the rights of Indigenous peoples. So it's a very nice, I think, segue, Prabinder, if we can go to you and hear your sense of the key issues around the impacts of the extractives on Indigenous peoples in the region.
Thanks, Patrick, and Jojalapa, namaskar to everyone firstly, and I also thank the working group as well as the Asia Indigenous Peoples Pact, my former employer, for giving me this opportunity to share some thoughts on this issue in this wonderful webinar. And I actually, after coming after Dr. Usha Ramanathan, I don't think, I think she's already captured it so well in those 5 points that she made. But I would, so it might be there might be nothing new in what I say, but basically what I'm gonna give you is some experiences of Indigenous defenders in particular, whom we were working with when I was working with Asia Indigenous Peoples Pact through this Indigenous Human Rights Defenders Network. Now, currently in my work with SEMSOs, I am not focusing on extractives or mining per se, because a lot of our work is particularly being focused on hydropower, which is a big issue in Nepal these days for the rights of Indigenous peoples. But again, what I'm speaking is based on the experiences of working with these awesome defenders who were defending their rights against these powerful mining companies in India, particularly in India, and also some in Bangladesh. And again, so basically my experiences coming from these 3 countries, though it's supposed to be an South Asia regional, but it's basically India, Bangladesh, and Nepal. For India, I think I already see a lot of wealth of knowledge from among our attendees too. So I won't go into deep about how extractives is impacting Adivasis or Indigenous peoples in India. But basically to say, it's not just the Adivasis that extractives are impacting in India, but our whole environment as well, because coal mining is one of the biggest issues in India, even when, as Patrick already mentioned, we are living in this age of global climate crisis. So in this context of coal mining, or let's say in any other mineral mining, it's often the Adivasis and the forest dwelling communities who bear the most brunt or most disproportionate impacts in the name of displacement, in the name of restrictions to their resources. But as Dr. Usha already mentioned, they are also fighting back. The case of this small indigenous group Dongria Kond against the powerful Adani mining corporation has always been a source of inspiration for indigenous movements, not just in India but also across the world. But at the same time, it's in the fighting back that they are facing the most difficult challenges. The Dongria Kond activists have been facing these criminalization for all these years now. They have to go and report themselves at the authorities almost every month, or 2 months or so, because their activism has been criminalized. And while we are doing this webinar, just last week there was an indigenous woman activist from Koya tribe, Hidme Markham, who again, she is an anti-mining activist from Chhattisgarh, who was violently arrested, bundled up in a car, basically because supposedly because of her work defending the rights of her communities and the environment against mining. So, that's basically one of the biggest challenges that we are facing, that, there are these companies that are coming to grab our lands. But again, when we are defending our lands, our people, our leaders, our activists are being criminalized, being killed. India, continues to be one of the most dangerous countries in the world for land and environmental defenders. I think 6 defenders killed in 2019, 2020, according to reports from NGOs such as Global Witness. And again, mining and extractives continue to be the most dangerous business sector around the world, with I think around 50 killings of defenders across the world because of their activism against these destructive mining projects. Lastly, about India, what I wanted, not just about India, but just to bring about bring it to a global perspective, or like why indigenous peoples are facing these challenges, is because, again, as Dr. Usa already mentioned, indigenous peoples occupy these lands, these waters, these resources, which they have been traditionally using and occupying, owning, in sync with the sustainable use of those resources, in sync with how those resources are meant to be used so that they are saved for our future generations. But then then comes these governments, these politicians, these land mafias, these these destructive companies who only see those lands and resources as source of financing, as a financial commodity, as source of making themselves rich. So there lies the problem, and I think I can give some of the solutions, but that I'll do later. But before, solutions and some good practices from my work, as Patrick was mentioning, also with the UN Permanent Forum, that I learned from other regions in the world. But before I do that, I just wanted to give some perspective from Bangladesh and Nepal too, because in Bangladesh and Nepal, unlike in India, the mineral mining is not such a big sector. In Bangladesh, of course, there is a big mining area, mining industry too. But from our work with indigenous communities in Bangladesh, or indigenous defenders in Bangladesh, particularly in Chittagong Hill Tracts region, what we have seen is not just mineral mining, but also sand mining, mining rocks and gravel from rivers have also been particularly affecting indigenous peoples and disproportionately impacting their environment, their water sources, their livelihoods. That's one thing. In Nepal too, limestone quarry, and sand extraction from rivers, as well as gravel, extracting gravel and stones from river, has been particularly impacting indigenous peoples, along with these hydropower projects for which those sand and gravel are mined for. Coming back to like, for staying on Nepal for a bit, again, right now there's not a big mining industry per se. There's I think the biggest mining industry in Nepal is limestone quarry, but recently they have discovered petroleum in western Nepal, and also some uranium in western Nepal. So we are trying to see what lies in the days ahead for us. I think I'll just stop there for a while. For now, and we'll come back to we'll share some more during the questions.
Thank you very much, Pradrindra. That was really valuable, and I think it was interesting also to hear some of those same themes came up in what you were saying, including the sort of that difference of a world view, and how do mining companies, extractive industries, and states accommodate, recognize, and respect a very different view of the world that indigenous peoples have, and their relationships to land and their cultures. You've also picked up the very real issues around the risks of speaking up and speaking out in the context, a global context of reducing civil society space, but that's felt particularly harshly by Indigenous Peoples' rights defenders, who are already suffering marginalisation and discrimination. And I hope that we'll come back to that, and that's we'll ask Helena, who we hope is joining us, to pick up on those issues as well. And then, of course, you raised the issue around coal extraction and Adani and those industries which have been impacting particularly, I think, in areas of India. And that brings us, I think, very neatly to our next speaker, Jennifer Rietbergen from the Responsible Mining Foundation. And Jennifer and the foundation have been involved in the Responsible Mining Index, which has been looking at what mining companies do, their policies and their practices, and has been seeking to find good examples of improved practices, among other things. And I hope that we can touch on some of those. Jennifer brings a lot of experience to the role even before becoming involved in the Responsible Mining Foundation. So it would be really great for us to hear about some of that research, Jennifer. If you can find any glimmers of hope also in terms of changes of practice from the mobilization of communities, from the engagement of communities. And one of the things I think is of particular interest is around the responsibilities of the extractivist industries in recognition of Indigenous peoples' rights, where although governments in South Asia have formally adopted the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, often in practice, they refuse that recognition. And so what does that mean for companies operating in that space? What are their responsibilities to those global standards? Thanks, Jennifer, very much.
Thank you, Patrick, and thank you to everybody who's involved in organising this important session. I must say it's a real honour and a privilege for me to take part in this, and I'm definitely here to learn. I'm not at all an expert in Indigenous people's rights or in this regional aspects of it, but I am speaking to you today from my home office here in rural France, but on behalf of the Responsible Mining Foundation, or RMF. And RMF is actually an independent research organisation that works to encourage continuous improvement among companies in the extractive value chain, more generally, mining plus oil and gas, etc. As part of our research, we produce every 2 years, which Patrick referred to, the Rmi, or the Responsible Mining Index reports. And these are global assessments of large-scale mining companies' policies and practices on a huge range of economic development, environmental, social, and governance issues. So I'd like to just share a few results from the Rmi Report 2020 that touches on some of the issues that are being discussed today. And it's important to note that these results that I'm going to mention are all based on publicly available information on the companies concerned. And of the 38 companies that we assess, among which are some of the world's largest mining companies, 3 are from the South Asia region, in fact from India, and those are Coal India, NMDC, and Vedanta. And of the wide range of issues that we cover, I'm going to touch on 4 today, and those relate to human rights defenders, FPIC, respect for Indigenous people more generally, and the issue of operational level grievance mechanisms. So I guess the overall comment I would give, first of all, is that the results across the 38 companies, the average results on all of those are very low, and the 3 Indian companies on the whole score below that low average. So to look first of all, at the very basic question of if companies do have, and have they made formal commitments on issues such as human rights defenders. We've heard already from Dr. Usha and from Prabindra about this issue. And it's maybe surprising, but it's equally shocking, I would say, that we found only one of these major mining companies to have made a formal and explicit commitment to respect the rights of human rights defenders. As Prabindra said, we know that the mining sector is the deadliest globally for human rights defenders and for land defenders. And with that in mind, there's a large gap there in terms of companies at least making a commitment on that issue. Equally, we looked at whether companies had made formal commitments to respect the rights of Indigenous peoples, to FPIC, to free, prior and informed consent. And there we found only 2 of these 38 large-scale mining companies to have made such a commitment. In fact, one of the companies we assessed came and asked the question, what does that mean, FPIC? What does free prior consent mean? It was not a concept they had come across before. So there is a huge gap and a huge need to drive change and basic change on these critical issues. And then if we look at company actions on respecting the rights of Indigenous peoples, the results are not more encouraging, I must say. So we looked at companies having company-wide, corporate level management systems in place, or standards or requirements that require their operations to, first of all, identify and work with those Indigenous groups who are potentially affected by their activities, and to plan with them strategies that would enable them and ensure that their rights and their needs and their interests are respected. And again, the majority of companies show little or no evidence of having those kind of company-wide standards in place. And here, though, it's actually interesting because there's a very wide range of results. So in fact, 4 of the companies scored the maximum level on that particular indicator, but 1/3 of the companies scored 0. So there was a very wide variation in what's going on in that particular instance. And then finally, just to touch on the mine site level results in terms of operational grievance mechanisms for potentially affected groups to be able to raise concerns and have those concerns addressed. We looked at 180 mine sites worldwide. And of those 180 mine sites, 2/3 of them showed no evidence of having any operational grievance mechanism for that. And in fact, only 1 of the 13 mine sites in India that we covered in that assessment showed any evidence of having an operating grievance mechanism. So those are just a few snapshots of the current trends that we've seen in the mining industry on those issues. So there's clearly a lot of work to do in driving change, and I think the work of my fellow panelists is absolutely critical in highlighting these issues and in making change happen. I'm going to come back to your question, Patrick, in the next round, I think, in terms of like solutions. I've got to say a sort of warning up front. We find hardly anything in the way of leading practices, and it's very hard to find good examples, but I'll do my best. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Jennifer. I'm not sure whether to thank you in some ways. It's a very, it's a very sobering picture. I think it will be a picture familiar to those people on the ground, all too depressingly familiar from what you've said. But I think I should thank you also because the work that you've done gives us a tool to use. I think really, and it's very helpful when the experiences of people on the ground are validated by the research of an organisation like yours. And in looking for good practices, I think you give us examples that change is possible, even if it's only one. There's a sense that change is possible. So then the challenge for us is how do we make that change? How do we encourage that change? And so we'll come back to that, but that's really, really helpful, Jennifer. Thank you very much and very succinct. I think now we're still waiting for one of our panelists to join us. I think we're plagued by technical issues. We've panelists in 6 countries, I think. So let's go to Demi, who I think can speak very directly to the issues that Jennifer has been talking about. He's an activist in Odisha, India. He's been involved in working with tribal communities, indigenous peoples across India in mobilizing and in challenging the impacts of the mining companies on those communities. And I think it would be great to hear from your experience on the ground, please.
Johar to all participants and the panelists. Actually, already in Indian perspective, 2-3 panelists already explained. But as a indigenous community, I would like to address some basic issue what we are facing in legal terms. First of all, we have been denied from our identity. So if our identity has been denied, there is no rights exist. Even if in UN mechanism, it was declared as indigenous people, but government of India has denied that there are no indigenous people in the India. So it is totally denied. So we can't connect with directly indigenous people. We can't represent. Secondly, in government of India also, the scheduled tribe they had declared to us, but till now they had not respected our cultural perspective. So it is again the denial of our basic rights. What Musa ma'am has already explained, that our cultural point of view. In many cases, I found in international organizations and this government also accepted only when they have some projects. Like Van Bandhu Yojana, DFID has given funds and they are mentioning the, for the upliftment of indigenous people. So it is the dual character of both international agency and our government perspective. Second point I would like to say is that human rights and the community or group rights both are misunderstood or misled to indigenous people's rights. In many cases or in all of law, it was mentioned that the human rights perspective, and it stands to individual rights only. So totally our community rights is denied, and nowhere it has been framed to justify our cultural rights or community rights. Then as earlier it was clearly told that FPIC free prior informed consent is must for any companies. But thing is that here everything is in pen and paper, and their dubbing or false reports have been made for FPIC. So nothing to worry for Indian perspective, because the status of indigenous people are poor, illiterate, and particularly in legal terms, they are not accustomed with any of the constitutional provisions nor the other legal provisions. So all rights have been denied. And interestingly, that constitutional rights have been, or all our rights have been denied through the process of law only. Like constitutional rights are denied through framing another law. After, if something have provisions in law, then also it has been changed next to policy, so that it can be denied. If policy is also considering a few points, then they will give another term, special purpose vehicle. So this kind of these are the way how our rights have been directly denied through the process of law. So where to move? And the good thing in extractive sector is that in 2015, Government of India has made one law that known as DMF, District Mineral Foundations or District Mineral Funds. We hope that we will get some few benefits, but now practicing is that these DMF funds are become district magistrates fund. So no access for community, no benefits for community, only the interest of government and the party politics are being fulfilled. Our wonders is that if we see the extractive industry, that pre-mining stage, mining stage, and post-mining, then it is totally our future is black, and with this, our future generations is going to extinct very soon. maybe for the betterment of this government or corporate. And in some officials, they are verbally telling that somebody have to sacrifice for the development of country. And maybe the indigenous community are the one who will extinct, then this development process will move. So these are my ground level experience, and we are suffering. I am also a displaced person, post development projects displaced person from Raurkela steel plant, one of the project which was post independent. Till now we are fighting for our rights, and it has been denied through time delay. We are suffering for last 3 generations, but still we are fighting on this, that we in one day we will get it. Ladenge, jitenge. This is our spirit, and we are working on these things. Thank you for all again. Johar.
Thank you very much, Danny. I think it's very powerful to hear your story for all of us, I think, because it's I think at the heart of both the struggles and movements for Indigenous people's rights and for human rights is solidarity, and a sense of solidarity, and I think we have a responsibility to act when we hear what you say, and I hope that's where our discussion can go, and your experiences help ground that this is still happening to you, that your struggle goes on still is, you know, it's a challenge for all of us. And I suspect for some of us in particular, in some parts of the world, it's also an indictment of us. And but we thank you for sharing, and maybe we can bear in mind what you've said as we discuss going forward. I think I'm hoping that we will also be joined by Helena. Is Helena with us also? Yes, great, that's great. So Helena, nice to see you. So Helena is joining us from Bangladesh, where she is an activist and an advocate. She's Assistant National Coordinator for the National Network around Indigenous Peoples Human Rights Defenders in Bangladesh. She's also involved has a leadership role in the Bangladesh Indigenous Women's Rights Network. And I think part of what we're discussing is the way in which extractives impact disproportionately on Indigenous peoples because they already experience discrimination and marginalization in their societies. And in relation to Indigenous women, that impact is amplified, reinforced, doubled because of the intersectionality of those discriminations. So we're really grateful that you can join us, Helena, and if you can share your experiences and perspectives from work in this area in Bangladesh, it would be great. Thank you. We have to unmute you.
Hello. Okay. Thank you, everyone, and thank you, the panelists, who is giving me the opportunity to share my experience in Bangladesh, how the people are suffering. And I think this is the big opportunity for the indigenous people that to get some space to share, to explore their experiences. And I already agreed with the other panelists and the speakers who spoke before me. And I think that it's very common, and the human rights, I think, abuses is directly connected. I think that directly connected with the extractives activities, which is I can say that, which is a big challenge for the indigenous peoples, I think, around the world. And I'm happy to come here to share that after the extractive activities, or how the people are facing, how they live in their places. So I would like to share that in Bangladesh also there is a coal mining companies. There is a case in North Bengal. There are some white clay mining in Netrakunas and stone abstraction in Chidang Hill Tracts and in the northeast Bangladesh in Sylhet region where I come from. And this is the big issues, I think, that for the people who are really, really close to the nature, who are totally dependent on the natural resources, and the way the activities impact in their daily life is like it's how to say, it's a very crucial thing that it's the bad impact on their life and their livelihood. And for
Okay, just we hope that Helena can come back to us. In the meantime, can I encourage all of the participants here to put questions and or use the chat also to share contributions, and if there are issues you want to be that you want to be addressed, then please use the chat room and the Q&A. And all the panelists can see the questions that you have. I think everybody should be able to see all the questions that are being put and the issues that are being put. And we'll try and come to those. Yeah, it seems, I think the sense is that there's a power cut, and so we just have to hope that power is restored, and I suppose that her more power is given to her also. So when she comes back, what we might do is then open I guess the floor to the panelists, because we've been very mean in the time allocated, and it would be nice, I think, to try and draw out some of the issues we've heard about, and for the panelists to discuss, perhaps ask each other issues, draw out some of the key impacts, but also what can be done, I think, and if there are examples of good practice that can be shared. Seems to me we are in this moment where COVID is giving us particular challenges and maybe also opportunities. And if I can share just an experience from two of our board members have been involved in a case where one of the world's largest mining companies, in Rio Tinto, last year, despite having had the best policies in the world, perhaps around Indigenous peoples, around participation, around recognition, despite many years of engagement with Indigenous communities and some very good relationships, a huge investment in establishing relationships, they destroyed the oldest known continuous art sites and cultural connections, physical human connections, dating back 46,000 years, which had very particular cultural, spiritual significance for the Indigenous community, but were also a heritage for Australia and for the world. And a mining company destroyed that last year, Rio Tinto in the Juukan Gorge. So there is this huge gap between laws we see all the time, between policies and between practice, and something there went incredibly badly wrong. our board members were involved in the advocacy around that, involving investment. And as a result of all the advocacy that took place, the outrage, not much has happened, but the leadership of the company has had to resign and at the input of at the demands of the investor community. So this is just so bad. But in many parts of the world, we're a long way even from that level of accountability. So perhaps we can open to our panel. Are there any particular issues that you'd like to pick up around the issues we've heard about, around the way in which extractives impact on Indigenous peoples, the particular risks that Indigenous peoples and their Indigenous peoples' rights defenders face in raising these concerns? I'd invite you to share any reflections or comments, please. Prabrinda?
Thanks, Patrick. I think, what I wanted to touch on was some of the questions that we are already getting from the participants, but also some of the guiding questions for this whole webinar. No, I mean, because what we are also, I think the point of this webinar is also to come up with some practical solutions. No, to ensure that mining companies respect the rights of Indigenous peoples. I think we have already analyzed the challenges all too well. One of the key challenges, as our friend from Odisha suggested, that there is no legal recognition of Indigenous peoples and their rights in South Asian countries. No, many South Asian countries, India, Bangladesh, do not recognize Indigenous peoples as such, as a distinct group with collective rights as per international human rights standards. Only Nepal recognizes Indigenous peoples, but again, they don't guarantee the rights as per the international standards, including the ILO Convention 169 and the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples in its laws. So I think that is one of the key issues. No, so I think the first thing that the states need to do is to undertake legal reforms in line with these international obligations towards the rights of Indigenous peoples. But then, the businesses have independent responsibilities to respect human rights in line with international laws, independent of the state's requirement or not. So I think the companies should be more proactive in recognizing Indigenous peoples and then guaranteeing those rights to them. No. What we see often is that the companies they get these license from the government in the capital, and then they go to these remote communities who don't know these procedures, bureaucratic procedures. Often they go with the license without any effective consultation, and then just start digging. And that's only when the communities are aware that there is mining happening. So that whole process is wrong. The companies should not only think that the license is the license from the government is the license to operate, but also they should get a license to operate from the communities themselves. No, I think I should make it pretty clear here that Indigenous communities have been mining minerals too. No, it's not that we don't use minerals at all. No, Indigenous communities also use minerals. In my community, there are lots of artisanal miners. In many Indigenous communities, we use gold, we use silver. No, so we do mining too, but we do mining in such a way that the earth is not impacted and the resources are not exhausted in just one generation. No, so the companies should also get license to operate their mining operations in such a way from the communities, so that there is sustainable use of these resources, and that is basically to say in partnership with the communities. No, what the companies they basically do, as I said earlier, is they get license from the government, they go to the communities, start mining. When the communities protest, they do some CSR activities just to persuade them, like a little kid, like a lollipop that they give to the little kid. So that's not the way to do it, is what I'm trying to say. And one of the key ideas that I saw in other regions, particularly in North America with Native American communities and First Nation communities in Canada, is that there are these mining companies which are run or like owned by mining Indigenous communities themselves, because they know their areas well. Yeah, often either these mining companies are owned by the indigenous communities, or they are these mining operations are done in such a way that the mining affected communities, or the indigenous communities in the mining areas, have strong say on how that mining is done. No? So basically, I think what I'm trying to say is, like, let's say if Adani tomorrow wants to still want to mine out Niamgiri Hills in Odisha, perhaps they should put one of the Dongria cones on their board of directors, not one of the, as in, like, they should give 51% of their mining of their board to Dongria cone representatives, and then let them decide if they how they want to do that mining in bauxite mining in Niamgiri. I think that would be the way to go if these mining companies really want to operate in indigenous areas. Some of my ideas, basically.
Thank you very much, Brurinder, and I thank you for also moving us towards that, looking at what can be done. That's the outcome of this session. And maybe I can ask Jennifer, come back to Jennifer then to share some examples, because I think in that report that you had 10, sort of eight key findings, but you found some examples from Canada and from a range of different jurisdictions of good practices. So if you could share those and any insights about that you found in the research about how did they get there, would be really helpful. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Patrick. So in terms of the more positive news, I think the number one thing is what you've already said, which is some companies have shown that it can be done. So some companies are scoring well on these indicators, which have shown across the board otherwise very low results. So I think that's already something that points the way forward for the other companies. And just because we've done these reports now twice, so we had the first and the second one last year, we can look for any signs of improvements between the two reports. And just overall, the scope of those assessments, we've seen on average a 17% increase in company performances across over those 2 years. And that is partly down to increased transparency on these issues, given that this is a public domain based research, but also we've seen some movement. Very basic things like a company has provided for the first time, has developed for the first time its human rights commitment, or it's shown evidence for the first time of actually rolling out its human rights due diligence procedures. So that's another kind of positive pointer. We also look alongside our scoring of the companies. We also look for what we call leading practices. We've got more than 70 practices now identified and on the website of the report. I just had a quick search this morning. So when I put in Indigenous people for the search, it came up with one example. And this was one example of a company that had actually prioritized Indigenous peoples in one particular area for their skills development program and for their employability skills development program. But that kind of brings me to another huge caveat here, because on the whole, we found over and over again, companies are very ready to share information about positive impacts they're having among the groups that they affect. In this case, it was skills development. They're very quiet, in fact, mostly silent completely on the negative impacts that they're having. So I think in terms of potential solutions, I think companies can go a long way by already just acknowledging the negative impacts that they are having on communities, and by actually having programs in place and targets and progress reports to show how they're addressing those negative impacts. I think that would go a long way already just to moving things forward. And then the final point I would make is that even with all those points taken into consideration, the industry cannot be left to self-regulate. That's clear. We have to do more. There's more drivers need to be turned on and activated to enable change to happen. You've already mentioned, I think yourself, Patrick, about the investor influence that is potentially there. We've seen it, for example, in terms of transparency around tailings management. We've seen it around individual mine sites where they're actually required by their investors to report on their environmental impacts. So there's definitely leverage there to activate. I don't know myself of anything that's actually been done in terms of investors pushing companies to do more on Indigenous peoples' rights, but that would certainly be a channel that would be worth exploring. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And I think this session is a part of that process of building awareness and knowledge and linkages, and maybe in the process of the next report, we can think about channels for feeding information from the ground into that research basis. So you're going to the companies, but also maybe there's scope to hear. I'm sure it happens already. You engage with the stakeholders in terms of those experiences and good practices from the ground too. Can I invite our other panelists to share and reflect on what they've heard so far? Any observations, Usha?
Debbie, you want to come in or?
Yeah, you can talk. Then I.
Okay. Just this that, in the movement, movements against this kind of displacement has actually achieved a lot in India. And it's not, it hasn't stopped companies from being who they are, and it hasn't stopped the state from having the ambitions that the state has. But the pushback has come in many ways. I think one of those which may be interesting to study and see if we can take it to other places is the 3 legislations that were brought, that have come in, which are very significant in terms of Indigenous people's rights. One was in 1996 called the PESA Act. It's Panchayat's Extension to Scheduled Areas Act, or Provisions of Panchayat's Extension to Scheduled Areas Act. It was a law. I really don't know how Parliament let that law come in. And after that, bureaucracies have been working very hard not to allow it to be operationalized. But so long as it's on the statute book, it becomes, one more, one more tool in the hands of people to be able to confront the state and the corporation. The second is the Forest Rights Act, which is like 100 and odd years of injustice on communities. Legal, by using the legal, which is what Demi was talking about, using the law to make people into encroachers and make people illegal, because the law can do that. The law will declare who is legal and who is illegal. And turning that and making it, take a 180-degree turn and come in, that's the Forest Rights Act. And the last is the Land Acquisition Act, where from, for the first time, we had the Land Acquisition Act from colonial vintage. And movements on the ground fought it. They worked on what they would want put into a law, whether it should be a separate law for acquisition and a separate law for compensation and rehabilitation, or whether it's got to be brought together. Legislations were created by them and, discussed publicly all around the country. And then finally, they forced Parliament to pass this law in 2013. And it's a very interesting piece of legislation. To my mind, it's like, it's a law that will not allow mining almost to happen, or, any of these projects to happen, because, a simple thing like saying, there's a provision in the law which says that if till rehabilitation is complete, and nobody knows what complete means, you can't have change of land user. Now that's an extraordinary statement, which basically means stop it. That's it. Obviously, nobody is following this dictum, but once you have it in the law, you have something further to battle with. And I really think having a no law situation is one thing, but when you have a law that works against communities, then to change that around and make that law speak for communities is extremely important. And I think, movements here have shown that that's possible. And the second thing is that, we had a very interesting change in nomenclature in the first decade of this century. Communities which used to be called primitive tribal groups were recast as particularly vulnerable tribal groups. And we've been trying to find out, it's an admission by the state that some communities are particularly vulnerable. So we're saying, okay, tell us what you thought they were particularly vulnerable to. Speak it and act on it. You can't say they are particularly vulnerable and that's it, and you don't know who they are and how they are vulnerable. So even things like this are things, and what Demi was talking about, not recognizing group rights, not recognizing community rights. I think it's the forest rights, because it came from the people and from communities that were affected, for the first time recognizes things like community rights. It also recognizes habitat rights. It also recognizes that people in those areas have a greater stake in and also a greater ability to deal with the environment in which they live. So it's not about, you know, somebody coming and having to plant trees or whatever. It's actually about an ecology that can get created. Of course, there is a huge gap between having a law of this kind and having it implemented. But having the law, I think, is one step. It's not the first step, but it is one step, and it's a useful step. That's all. I mean, I don't want to over stretch it, but having it also means that the illegalizing of people comes down to that extent. And that too is very important, especially. Of course, the illegalizing of protest will continue to happen, but those exist anyway. So I'm saying that in that, if we're able to see how we can push this in, I mean, push this movement along, it will be very useful. And one last thing, which is, I think, you know, this COVID that you were referring to, Patrick, you know, we've often been talking about it as this long pause that we never asked for but got. And we can't come back from the long pause as if we had just stopped with our mouths open, and the moment the pause is over, we continue the same conversation. This is, you know, it's really given us a chance to stop and think what we are doing. And if there's one thing that has become clear, it's that mainstream communities and their ways of life are unsustainable. So it seems like a great time, not just to recognize this, but to actually create another imagination.
Thank you, Usha. I think that's really, yeah, it's a lovely way of describing it. That long pause, I think, in that sense, if we link the long pause with the reality that we have to do things differently, that's what the Glasgow Summit on the climate emergency will be about. The world simply cannot continue as it was continuing before COVID. And I think we have seen with COVID that things become possible that we thought were impossible. And we need to reflect. But the reality is, if we are to achieve what we need to achieve for the world to be inhabitable, then coal needs to stay in the ground, or the vast bulk of coal that is there, and that has particular implications for the extractive industry. But conversely, if we're transitioning to green, I think the report from Responsible Mining Foundation is saying that's likely to increase pressures also on many Indigenous communities. And so there is that imperative to do things differently, but we have that chance now if it's taken. So Demi, I'm sorry, please, can we come to you? You've been very patient.
Yeah, thank you. Actually, 2 days back, in Mahanadi Coalfield Limited, MCL, they had violated environmental law and environmental concern of the people. Also, they reported that we had made everything okay. For last 30 days, people were demonstrating peacefully, in spite of High Court order that you have to build another road corridor for transporting of coal, because dust, environment, air and water pollutions are rampant in those areas. 2 days back, children have been arrested. Around 100 men and women have been arrested. So this is the situation how in Odisha, Hemgir block of Sundargarh district is happening just 2 days back. So how it is possible that a state which is arresting the primary school children only to protect the interest of the corporation? That is also government unit. This is the situation where I always ask the general audience how tribal people or indigenous people will be protected. Just now, our government is doing every extractive industry in private hand. So if private, all will go to private hands, where is the legislation protections? In spite of legislation protections, where will be it is a very dangerous situation for us. So not only the human rights defenders, but the people who are struggling for existence, their livelihood, they have been thrust. So for this concern should be one of serious concern for the Indian perspective, particularly indigenous people. In spite of all legislations, code directions, and if administration and the corporation both they globe together and doing wrong with the indigenous people, then where we should move? That's why earlier I told that more sooner this indigenous people will extinct. So very acute situation. I'm unable to address how to deal with in international level.
Patrick, would you allow me to ask a question to some of my fellow panelists?
Please do.
I would really like to ask Dr. Usha and Demi in particular, because I did some brief reading this morning, and please let me know if this is correct. From what I saw is that the Coal Bearing Areas Act in India has no provisions, no requirements for companies to seek consent, let alone consultation, or indeed to provide compensation to indigenous people or to anybody affected by coal mining projects. Is that your understanding too? And if so, it's obviously it's very obvious that companies need to do the right thing no matter whether it's provided or not. Thank you. Thank you.
Actually, you are right. In Coal Bearing Act, there is no provisions for consultation with the community. But now PESA Act has been come. So it is existing law where informed consent is a must. In one, that's why earlier I told that constitutional rights has been denied by introducing new law, and that new law has been denied by introducing some policy. So then they've made some special purpose vehicle like some economic zone or some corridor. So there no law, no constitution, nothing will apply. So, in that way, High Court of Chhattisgarh has been given saying that no, Coal Bearing Act, in Coal Bearing Act you can acquire, but prior consultation is a must. So it means PESA Act will be valid. Without PESA clearance, you can't go ahead. But still, nobody are caring. That's our thing. Even if in what they are doing, linear projects, they are mentioning in linear projects, no consultation is required. The central government has notified one notification. Then in state of Andhra Pradesh High Court, they overruled that notification, saying that in scheduled area, you are mandatory to consult, otherwise your projects will not be valid. So positive things are there, but how our innocent people, those who don't know regarding these legal provisions and the legal remedial things, so we are unable to access all our rights. Another one burning example that we had fought for our indigenous people's rights, that Odisha government has given one regulation that minimum 5 acres of land should be there for each family. And they had order from revenue department that displaced people should be given minimum 5 acres. For last 3 years, we are struggling. Neither state is willing to give us 5 acres, nor this not corporation railway authority, they are willing to give any job for livelihood. So these are the, in every respect, what you are telling is correct, that there are many laws to crush us, but there are many laws to protect us also. There are more judgments on supportive way, but there are also many judgments who is against us. And we don't have any such a forum where we analyze and communicate to the community how to use these as a tools. Because we don't have such a platform. We have on a platform MMP, Mines Mineral People, national level, but we are not so much of capacity, or our setup is not in vast way, so that we can address each and every aspect of our issues in indigenous peoples. But there are laws overruling each other. That's particularly nowadays we are calling in scheduled area, particularly this indigenous peoples territory, are conflict zone with legal provisions. Totally conflict zone with law. There are several laws overriding each other. So those who have power, those then they have the turn. And we are many times we are requesting the government or authority to address all these conflicting laws, at least resolve these things. But nobody cares. Executives, they say this legislature will do this thing. Legislature say we are helpless. The development process had to go. So whatever it is there, it should remain, and the things should move. So this is the voice of our legislature and the bureaucrats. While we are struggling, we are facing the worst form of the government.
Thank you.
Thank you. And your question was also to Usha?
Helena's back. I think I'll just wait for her to.
Okay, that's very good. Helena, welcome back. More power to you. Yes, great. So it's very appropriate to pick up the discussion with you now. Mute, you're on mute still. Sorry, unmute. Thank
Hello?
you. Yeah.
Okay. Then, yeah, thank you very much for waiting. And I think that this is my good luck that I can join you again. Where I was that the impact of the extraction of the stone extraction, or like this, all the extractive activities. So I just want to mention that, and I'm agree with the earlier speakers, that it's the bad impact of the extractive activities on life of the indigenous peoples. And it is totally hampered the whole system of the living style of the indigenous people. For example, that where I come from, that in Sylhet region, in Jaflong area, stone and sand lifting is the big issues in our area, that which for this reason one of Khasi village we call Borla Punji already vanished. Almost all the people, only few families are still there, but the rest, they are displaced from their own areas. And I want to mention also for this stone extraction. So the people who are depending on river for their food, for their pure drinking water, so it's totally damaged and totally hampered their livelihood. And because I hope that you know that the Khasi people who are totally dependent on bitter leaf garden, so their livelihood to earn, to support their family, their children, their medical facilities. So this is the big challenge for the people there also who are still living in Jaflong area. And you know that in 2015, High Court, the High Court ordered to stop the stone and sand lifting, but the companies who are there have the much interest in the stone and sand lifting. So they still somehow they convinced the local authorities, and they start again to lifting this stone and sand. And I want to mention that for these activities, the flow of the river also already changed, and the people there during the winter season, they struggle a lot for drinking water. Now they are, especially in the winter season, they have to go far long away to collect the pure drinking water before they get the food, the fish, shrimp in the water. But due to this activity, stone and sand lifting, so the quantity is less now. And the indigenous people there, who get the protein there from the river, from the forest. So it is for them that a big challenge that due to the activities, the flood also affected during the summer season, during the rainy season. Most of the area close to the village of the Khasi people, affected already. And one of the important thing I want to mention that the displacement already I had, and the land issues here also. Like this activities, it not that only for food, only for their drinking water, only for their livelihood, but the indigenous people there very much it's a high risk to lose their living land there, where they depend the land there. And not only that, the environment in the area where it is happened, it's totally affected. Air pollution, the water and the river bodies also affected, spread, the pollution spread everywhere. Many people are having the problem to breathe. So I think that this is the big challenge for the indigenous people here also, to face the extractive, like this extraction where they are living. And I would like to present my recommendation through this floor to the government also, who can take the good initiative to protect the air pollution, to protect the environment, and especially the indigenous people who are still living there. And I think that the state, should ratify ILO 169, and the UNDRIP also, where they mention that the self-determination of the indigenous people. And the big challenge for the indigenous people here is that the state doesn't recognize properly as indigenous people here for us. It's a big challenge. And where it is a big challenge of recognition, So there is also linked with the lack of, participation in the political parties, where the parties can take initiatives to protect their rights, their lands, their their how they live in their own village, in their own environment. So I think that this is, I want to recommend that to recognize, the state should recognize UNDRIP and 169 of ILO Convention. And in the last, I want to say that the IFI, the International Financial Institution, should make a strong monitoring mechanism to the companies or to the institution, to the corporate which they donated. I think that if they do the strong monitoring, that is it whether they're concerned about FPIC of the indigenous people, of the local people, or whether not. And if there is a strong monitoring mechanism there, so I think that there is a hope to protect the rights of the indigenous peoples. And I think that it's also that to ensure, the corporate social responsibility, that where the people that are living, not just to do their own interest, but the local people who are suffering there, sufferer. So to do, that to complete their social responsibility also. So I think that this is the time, if we want to make a beautiful world for the whole world, that it is immediately to take step, to stop this illegal coal mining, stone abstraction, like these activities, and just respect the culture of the indigenous people, and let them, to take care how the way they take care of the mother of our world. So thank you very much. And I don't know, is it the already I finished.
You brought us very beautifully, I think, to close to the end of the session. Oh. I think my timing is terrible. I've lost track of what time zone I'm in, but I think you've spoken very powerfully and in a way that speaks very directly to the issues, but to how do we create the kind of beautiful world that we need to have, a livable world too. And I would like, I'm not sure that we have, we've got 2 minutes to closing. Are there any final remarks from any of the panelists before I thank you all? Usha.
Because there's a question, and I think the question, it may be fair to answer it, about younger people aspiring to more paying jobs. That's what corporates are saying. Is it true or not? My question, my answer to that really would be, why shouldn't people of all communities have aspirations of different kinds? And why should it be only one kind? And why should they be threatened with their identities being destroyed because they have aspirations that may go beyond their geographical area or what is considered their traditional occupation? I think there are many things like this which are done deliberately to deny identity as a group or a community to people. And that really has to be resisted. And in India, we have this thing where they say, oh, what tribal community? Nobody's tribal. Everybody wants to go and work in the factory or in, to do their sciences or do whatever. So the idea that you lose your identity if you engage with the mainstream is something that we'll have to fight. And just one last thing in this, that they've also asked, is Stan Swami so big that his being picked up has a chilling effect? And I think I should say that he is a highly respected person who's been working in the field and who's been working among tribal communities for a very long time. And everybody has, everybody who's engaged with him knows that he's not just honest, but also compassionate, and he's been working with integrity in this area. So to have somebody like that criminalized, whether it whether it has a chilling effect on everyone or not, there is a disenchantment. There's a kind of sense that you can't depend on the law or legal institutions to be legal. And that's a very bad place to be. So, just the last thing, which is that I think in all of this, what we are seeing now around us is everything being turned into a commodity. I mean, I work on technology and I can see how our personal information too is being, the datafication of people is happening all around us. Like the rest of us doesn't matter right now. It's just the data. So you find that land as a commodity is something that they've been playing with for the longest time. And now we are finding that rights are settled on people so that they can be taken away. That till it is settled, you can't take it away. And therefore, the settlement of rights happens to take it away. I think we really need to have this push that land is not just a commodity and it is not for the market. That's not the primary purpose of land. And that's something that we may need to keep pushing along with the idea of impunity.
Thank you very much, Usha, and thank you for addressing the questions from the floor as well. That's very good of you. Prabrinda?
I also just wanted to touch on one of the questions, one of the questions in the panel, but also the question regarding Stan Swami, because that's what we see not just in India, but in other countries too, that they target a particular indigenous leader so that there is this chilling effect, so that there is this fear in the community, there is this, kind of trauma among other activists when they carry out so that they are discouraged from carrying out their activism. What we have also seen in India and in Nepal in the past was that the indigenous activists were falsely accused as Naxals or Maoists or insurgents. Currently now, in the past they used to be insurgents. Now we are terrorists by ourselves, anti-development, ethnic, people with ethnic prejudice. So all of this is basically a kind of stigmatization that happens against indigenous defenders to discourage us from our activism. That has been well documented already. Then the other thing that I really wanted to talk about also is the issue of FPIC that we have been talking about. Just very quickly, is that in many countries, like our friends from India has already been saying there is this already some legal provisions for FPIC, though it is not there in Nepal and in Bangladesh. But still, the FPIC is not there is not a common understanding of FPIC between indigenous communities and investors and states. So basically, it needs to be worked out in line with what it was actually supposed to be, a tool to exercise our self-determination. In many countries, indigenous communities have developed their own FPIC protocols, how FPIC should be obtained from them and then implemented. So I think that should be an exercise that companies, investors, governments should do collectively with indigenous peoples, and not just label any compensation agreement or any license as falsely label them as FPIC. And just very quickly clarification is, like, I was wrongly referring to the wrong company of Adani in relation to Niamgiri Hills. It was Vedanta, so I just wanted to correct myself too. Thank you, Patrick.
Great, thank you very much, Brinda. And I think we're out of time. We're about to be booted off our virtual space. So I'd like to thank you all very much. It's a very rich session. I hope we can come back in a year's time and we can say that we've seen change. It seems to me that at least a virtual space provides a potential to connect people on the ground with the people making the decisions, can close some of those spaces and close the distance so that we do hear what FPIC means for Indigenous peoples, and they can build the understanding of the companies and of the state to make change. So the movement building will continue. Thank you very much, everybody. I'm sorry the time is short, and we'll send around links and etc. But good luck to all of you in the work that you do. It's incredibly important, and we will offer our support in whatever way we can. And good luck. Thank you very much. Dory, I think you need to say some things too. So thank you. Thank you all.
Thank you, panelists. That was a wonderful session. I'm just here to announce to everyone that the next session will actually take place in this room. So if you would like, feel free to stick around. The next session is the need for an extractive non-judicial grievance mechanism showcasing examples. And it will start at 6:30 p.m. India Standard Time. So just under 30 minutes from now. So everyone can hang tight, or you can log off and log back in later. Either way, this room will be open for everyone to hang out in, but we will be on mute throughout. Thank you again.
Thanks, Dory. Thank you all very much, everybody. And I'm sorry for the technical problems, Helen. But let's stay in touch. And you know, I think there are things we can do. So, yeah. But thank you, and apologies for any bad moderating. So,
it was all good.
Anyway, nice seeing you all and working with you.
Very appreciate it.
Yeah, good luck. Stay safe, please. Thank you.